In today's video, we're going to be talking about the new strategic Bitcoin reserve and digital asset stockpile. If you didn't see the news, on 7 March, this past Friday, President Trump signed an executive order initiating this particular reserve and digital asset stockpile. Although the news isn't particularly positive, there are groups of people on both sides of the argument. Some still think it's a good idea, many think it's not a good idea, and many of those who initially wanted this to become a reality are very upset with how it's becoming a reality. Today we're going to talk about all the details, and I'll give you some of my thoughts about this particular executive order and why I think we are where we are today. I'll start by saying that for those of you who don't know, Bitcoin is seen as a digital version of gold. Now, this has a lot to do with its scarcity. Only 21 million Bitcoin will ever be produced. That means that no government or no power can produce additional Bitcoin at any point in time. This is a currency that cannot be inflated. Now, this is very different from the US dollar, which can be printed in times of need. This has been both a tool that has benefited us and hurt us in many ways globally. Now, on top of its scarcity, Bitcoin is also seen as really secure. The programming that went into this coin has proven itself very effective over time. There have to date been no major hacks of this system, and the system continues to run in a very effective way. Now, there certainly are vulnerabilities around Bitcoin. What you've probably heard of when you think of vulnerabilities has more to do with how people store their personal Bitcoin, whether they use a cold wallet or a hot wallet, and those particular vulnerabilities have been exploited by many people for a very long time. But the digital asset itself has not been exploited or manipulated in any way since its inception. These are some of the reasons why the conversation around starting a Bitcoin strategic reserve began back during the campaign of Donald Trump. Now, I will point out here that there is some irony. President Trump, during his first presidency and campaign, really did not have a lot of nice things to say about Bitcoin or cryptocurrency in general. I believe he was quoted as calling it a fake currency and had very little positive to say about any type of digital asset. Now, his evolution in thinking over time, it's not for me to judge. I think it's good that politicians are open to changing their minds. And so if we just take the base case and say that he was convinced that this is a good thing and a positive thing for society, then that's acceptable. But you can't ignore the facts. And there were lots and lots of Bitcoin advocates lobbying the president and putting a lot of money into his campaign in order to ensure a favorable outcome and positive direction for Bitcoin in the future. Now, this is no different from any other major interest. This is how our political system has been set up for a very long time, and big interests do invest lots of money in things that they care about to make sure and to lobby for their causes. Advocates of this strategic Bitcoin reserve were really thinking that it would only incorporate Bitcoin because of those very reasons, the scarcity and security factors I discussed at the beginning of the video. Other digital assets have all sorts of vulnerabilities. There are meme coins, there are other altcoins that frankly do not offer the same level of scarcity or security that Bitcoin does, and therefore really don't measure up to how we've had strategic reserves in the past. Primarily, gold has been used for a strategic reserve. And so thinking through the core components of gold and why that's worked, it specifically has to do with its scarcity. You can't just make new gold. Now, you can go mine gold, but it is a scarce resource. And so you have to find it, you have to mine it. It takes a lot of energy and effort, and it's also a physical asset. And so it's held and it has value. Everybody desires gold. Now, the advantages of a digital version of gold are many, but some of the most obvious include the fact that it's so easily transferred. It doesn't create a big physical footprint, and it can be easily transacted across the world in very short amounts of time. Now, representations of gold have been created to do some of this, but it never was really a substitute for the actual physical gold. And so in order for the reserve to exist, physical gold would have to be held. Now, in a digital form of digital gold, there is an ongoing conversation about how Bitcoin in particular might substitute for something like gold. Now, there are tons of arguments here on both sides as to whether or not this can actually happen, and that's not really the point of today's video. Just to give you some of the history though, that's why Bitcoin finds itself now in a position to be put into a strategic national reserve. Now, on Friday, when this executive order was signed, a lot of advocates were not very pleased that the word digital asset stockpile was also included in the language. And there weren't very many details about this when it started leaking before the executive order was released. Now we've seen, in fact, what the president has in mind. So to summarize the executive order, there are basically a couple of components. The first is that Bitcoin will be used as a strategic reserve. Now, all of the agencies currently holding Bitcoin, likely through seizure, through some sort of illicit activity, these Bitcoin will be transferred to the Treasury and held indefinitely. They will not be sold and they will not be manipulated in any way. They'll just be held in the reserve. All agencies have about 30 days to comply with this particular order. Now, all of this Bitcoin that the United States has was acquired from those who were engaged in illegal activity. And so now the Bitcoin will be held and put into this stockpile. Now, this same case applies for all digital assets that are acquired through illicit activity. There are lots of other individuals committing crimes that hold these other assets. And through those crimes, they were forced to relinquish those assets to the United States government. Those same assets will be held in a digital asset stockpile. Again, none of those assets will be up for sale. They'll just be held indefinitely in this stockpile. Now, from there, things start to diverge a bit. In the section on Bitcoin, the president highlights an option to explore ways of purchasing Bitcoin so far as it doesn't cost the American taxpayer any additional money. And so if any purchases of Bitcoin in the future do not add to the deficit that we currently have and do not increase taxes for the US taxpayer, then there might be an opportunity to buy new Bitcoin. But if those two conditions are not met, no additional Bitcoin will be purchased in a strategic way and held in this Bitcoin reserve. Now, if we jump down to the digital asset pile, this exemption does not exist. There will be no purchasing of additional digital assets. Only those that were forfeited to the US government through some sort of illicit activity will be put into that stockpile. Now, when this idea was first teased, I think it was a week or two ago, there was mention of Bitcoin and digital assets, but the details had not been released. Now that we know the details, it seems like maybe something changed between the time it was first discussed and now. Because at that time, there was a lot of confusion and anger about the addition of other digital assets. It's very difficult to make an argument that digital assets in general, outside of Bitcoin, could be strategic in any way for long-term holding. They're very volatile assets that really are not pinned to anything in specific. They're all speculation. And in some ways, it's just a modern form of gambling around which of these coins might actually succeed in the long term. Bitcoin, however, was seen as a very tried and true, long-performing asset, at least relative to other digital currencies. But because of this, it was seen as the only real candidate to be in a strategic reserve that made sense. Now, this outpour of irritation may have pushed the president to alter his plans. We will never know. But in the current form of the executive order, no additional digital assets will be purchased. Only those that are seized will be put into the stockpile. From my perspective, this lessens the concern because we aren't actively going out and buying these speculative resources and putting them into a strategic stockpile. Instead, we're just seizing these assets when they're found to be a part of an illicit activity. Now, I would advocate for something more like selling off of all digital assets that aren't Bitcoin in order to fund some of the law enforcement activities that are going into these efforts. I think that makes a lot more sense because these digital assets are very speculative in nature. They'll ebb and flow, they're volatile. The majority of them will eventually go to zero and have very little value. I think these digital assets should be sold immediately. The proceeds should be used to fund the federal agencies that are fighting crimes around digital assets, therefore lessening the taxpayers' burden overall. Now with Bitcoin, it makes a lot of sense to hold Bitcoin for the long term. In order for this to be a strategic reserve and the stockpile to build and grow, there has to be a plan to acquire more Bitcoin. Now currently, as it stands, there isn't a plan in place. They are, like I mentioned, open to opportunities that do not put a burden on the US taxpayer or add to the deficit, but one might argue that this is a way to ultimately reduce the deficit. If in fact Bitcoin does perform as it has over the last decade or so, one would expect the currency to continue to multiply in value. The whole premise behind using Bitcoin as a strategic reserve would argue that you also need to be adding to the stockpile. You need to be buying more and more and more to hedge against all of the other economic factors that are impacting the financial system. And so by just holding some Bitcoin, it's really just a half measure. In some ways, it's exactly what we were doing. We were just holding the Bitcoin that we seized anyway. Now it's going to be co-located under the Treasury and explicitly denoted as a strategic reserve. But if there's no way of increasing this stockpile over time, this is really not anything new. Now, the executive order also allows for usage of some of these digital assets, both Bitcoin and otherwise, to fund law enforcement efforts as agreed. I think this is excellent. This has been happening already, so it just codifies this particular approach to management of Bitcoin and digital assets. But again, in a lot of ways, this isn't much different from what we were doing previously. The only real evolution is now we're recognizing that there's an official strategic reserve of Bitcoin and digital assets, and this will live on into the future, at least under the current administration. Like all things with the current administration, we just need more time to see where this is going to go. I personally don't see this as a very big shift in current policy. This has been evidenced by the price of Bitcoin. It's only gone down since this strategic reserve was initiated. There was a lot of expectation about this happening, and that was bolstering the price for a bit of time. But now that those hopes have been extinguished and the reality is in front of us, it's not exactly the rosy picture that most advocates of cryptocurrency were hoping for. Now, this unfortunately will leave that large contingent of people feeling fairly disappointed in the president's efforts. I don't know if this will yield other results down the line, if changes will be made to account for some of this disappointment. All those things could happen. There's a long, nearly 4-year period of time in front of us to see how this evolves. But for now, it really seems like more of the same and some recognition that Bitcoin is a legitimate financial vehicle. I think these developments, by and large, are positive for the community, but they didn't necessarily yield the results that were expected. And so we're not seeing the great celebration that was hoped for initially. I don't know about you, but I'm excited to see where this goes. I'm certainly not changing my strategy toward digital currency at all. I invest very minimally in Bitcoin because I believe in the fundamental principles of Bitcoin. And I think some of the ideals behind the establishment of Bitcoin are aspirational. These are things that I believe in to my core. And so I'm willing to support it at that level, but certainly not at a greater level. Most people who are jumping into digital currencies and Bitcoin are doing so in a very speculative way. They're doing so to gamble. They're doing so hoping that they're going to make a lot of money in a short amount of time. I don't believe in that philosophy as an investing philosophy. And even though it does happen for some people, it's a very small amount of people. There's a much larger group of people that actually suffer greatly for engaging in these types of activities. And so, like always, I caution you to think long and hard about how you invest your hard-earned dollars. I personally do not advocate that you do one thing over another, but I wouldn't run out and buy a bunch of digital currencies based upon the news of this executive order, thinking that somehow this is going to bolster that community in a big financial way. I hope you've gotten some value from today's video. Like always, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, throw a comment down below, let me know what you're thinking, if you're enjoying this content, or if you'd like to hear from me on a different topic. I welcome your thoughts. I hope, as always, that you're having a great week, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.